A century before Marin Keane ever sets foot on New Avalon, 5 women vanish from the isolated Vermont island without leaving behind bodies, witnesses, or a believable explanation. What remains is stranger than a crime scene. 5 dresses hanging from the branches of an ancient oak, each one seemingly representing a missing woman. The image turns the disappearance into folklore. Murder, escape, witchcraft, and supernatural punishment all become possible answers, but none can be proven. Riley Sager begins with something more powerful than certainty, an empty space people are desperate to fill. When facts disappear, mythology rushes in. New Avalon becomes frightening precisely because nobody knows what happened. Chapter 2. Marin Keane, the unknown actress in the present day. Marin Keane is a struggling actress surviving on minor work, failed auditions, and the humiliation of watching other people become what she hoped to be. Then acclaimed young director Ronan Peters unexpectedly casts her in a major movie about the New Avalon mystery. The project also stars Violet Wright, a legendary actress Marin has admired for years. For Marin, the offer feels less like another job than a rescue from invisibility. Ambition changes how danger is interpreted. Marin is not merely going to an island. She is entering a system that knows how badly she wants to be chosen. Chapter 3. The role she didn't expect. Marin learns she will portray Daisy Rue, the young woman whose recovered diary shaped almost everything the public believes about the 1926 disappearances. The assignment is larger than Marin expected, making her effectively the emotional center of Ronan's film, rather than a disposable supporting player. Yet even before production begins, uncertainty follows her. Lindy, the actress Marin replaced, appears near the mainland dock and warns her about going to New Avalon. Ronan dismisses Lindy as unstable, encouraging Marin to see the warning as bitterness rather than evidence. Ronan does not need to force Marin onto the island. He only needs to control how she interprets the person warning her. Narrative power begins before the cameras roll. Chapter 4. New Avalon. The cast reaches New Avalon, where Ronan has designed an immersive rehearsal period. Phones are surrendered. Electricity is absent. Modern clothes are replaced with period clothing. The actors will eat, sleep, and rehearse as if they have stepped back into 1926. Alongside Marin and Violet are actresses Suzie Hutchinson, Heather Benchley, and Julianne Brown, plus producer Loretta Zener and assistant Brad Brillstein. Strange 6-petaled symbols mark the trees, and the isolation immediately changes the group's psychology. Without phones, outside information, or easy escape, every rumor becomes louder. Ronan calls it authenticity. Isolation is also a mechanism of control. Chapter 5. Daisy Rue's diary. Ronan gives Marin Daisy's diary so she can understand the woman she is playing. In the 1926 entries, Daisy describes being taken in by wealthy spiritualist Ruth Hume Semple and brought to New Avalon, where she believes she is living with several other women: Jonquil Collins, Phoebe Minifer, and Katrina Fisk. Each woman seems connected to the paranormal in a different way. Ruth claims mediumistic abilities, Katrina experiences visions, Phoebe is unusually empathic, and Daisy believes she can hear the dead. The diary feels intimate enough to be trusted, which makes it dangerous evidence. A first-person account gives access to perception, not necessarily truth. Chapter 6. The hexapoils. Daisy's entries describe the strange symbols carved throughout New Avalon. Ruth calls them hexapoils and explains that the island has long attracted stories about spiritual practices and dark rituals. At the center of the woods stands a stone slab, a place that looks sinister enough to invite any interpretation the frightened mind wants to place upon it. Much later, the truth behind many of the symbols proves less supernatural. Ruth's father, Roderick, had carved them obsessively while being tormented by guilt over the deaths connected to the weapons business that made his fortune. The symbols embody the novel's central idea. Something that looks occult may have a human explanation, and the human explanation can be just as haunted. Chapter 7. The first seance of 1926. In Daisy's diary, the women conduct a seance. Something seems to answer them and identifies itself as Azra. Daisy understands Azra as a hostile spirit trapped somewhere beyond the living world. The entity warns her that she will be the last. Soon lightning strikes the great tree, the atmosphere of the island turns oppressive, and fear begins replacing trust. Once the women accept that an outside evil is present, every strange event becomes proof of it. Fear begins editing reality before ordinary explanations can be tested. Chapter 8. A Seance. 100 years later, Ronan decides the modern cast should perform a seance of their own. The atmosphere is theatrical, but what happens feels disturbingly personal. The board appears to move by itself. A framed object falls and the name Azra returns. Most unsettling of all, the supposed presence seems to know the names of people connected to the cast's private grief. Heather's cousin Clarence, Julianne's husband Dean, Violet's father Frank, Ronan's friend Elise, and Marin's sister Molly. The seance works because it reaches into their private grief. The supernatural possibility is frightening, but so is the alternative. Someone present knows their wounds and is deliberately pressing on them. Chapter 9. Molly Marin. His deepest wound is the death of her older sister Molly. When Marin was 4 and Molly was 11, Molly drowned in the family pool after asking Marin to come outside with her. Marin did not go, and the child she was turned that ordinary choice into a lifelong moral sentence. Years later, Marin believed she saw Molly's ghost. On New Avalon, she begins seeing her again, wet, impossible, standing where no dead sister should be. Molly is the perfect ghost because guilt keeps replaying a moment. New Avalon does not need to invent Marin's fear. It only gives shape to one already living inside her. Chapter 10. The island closes. During the modern seance, Brad suddenly collapses with what appears to be a severe medical emergency. Loretta takes him to the mainland in the island's only available boat, and the remaining group soon realizes Brad also has their phones. Communication vanishes at exactly the moment they need it most. The parallel with Daisy's diary becomes impossible to ignore. In 1926, the women also discovered that their boat was gone. The cast is now physically trapped inside the story they came to recreate. They are actors trained to imitate emotion, yet once the old mystery is reproduced around them, performance stops feeling safe. Chapter 11. I Am Out. Daisy's diary grows more disturbing. She finds words written in it that she does not remember writing, including a message suggesting that something has escaped. The women become suspicious of one another, and Ruth warns that Azra may be responsible for the growing chaos. Daisy also discovers that Ruth has been writing privately about her, describing Daisy as unusually powerful. What looks at first like paranormal escalation is also a story about identity under pressure. Daisy increasingly experiences thoughts, actions, and written words as if they belong to someone else. The diary is not merely recording a haunting. It is recording a mind that cannot fully explain itself. The genre trains us to look outward for a monster, not inward for fragmentation. Chapter 12. Suzie disappears. The modern nightmare begins to copy the old one more directly when Suzie disappears. Her clothing appears in the famous tree, echoing the 5 dresses left behind in 1926. A video camera is discovered near the clearing, and the footage appears to show Suzie moving through the woods before someone approaches her. Marin also knows Ronan visited Suzie's cottage the previous night, making him increasingly suspicious. The group no longer has one shared reality. Everyone works with incomplete information and private suspicion. Once trust fractures, the island barely needs a supernatural force. Chapter 13. The women vanish again. The disappearances continue. Heather tries to use a flashlight to signal the mainland, then vanishes, leaving another dress behind. Julianne later believes she sees her dead husband, Dean, runs outside, and disappears as well. At the same time, Marin keeps catching glimpses of Molly. The repetition seems too precise to be coincidence. 100 years earlier, Daisy's diary described Katrina, Jonquil, and Phoebe disappearing one after another. Now Marin is watching the same pattern form around her. Once people believe the past is repeating, they begin expecting the next beat. New Avalon becomes a story whose ending everyone fears has already been written. Chapter 14. Violet's Secrets. Marin begins investigating the people around her, rather than the ghosts. In Violet's room, she finds books about witchcraft, demonology, and the symbols of the island. More importantly, she discovers a hidden phone. Violet also reveals that she and Loretta are sisters, adding another concealed relationship to a group already built on half-truths. Marin starts to suspect that Brad's illness may have been manufactured and that the seance could have been engineered. This is the moment her fear becomes skepticism. Instead of asking what Azra wants, she starts asking who benefits from everyone believing in Azra. Her best question is no longer, "Is this frightening?" but "Who gains power if I believe it?" Chapter 15. The dead walk back. In Marin's suspicions are confirmed in spectacular fashion when the missing women return alive. Suzie, Heather, and Julianne were never taken by a supernatural force. Brad's illness was staged. Loretta and Brad used an old bootlegger's cove to move secretly on and off New Avalon. Suzie's disturbing footage was manufactured. Heather hid after her staged attempt to signal for help. The seance had also been manipulated. The entire haunting was constructed. The reveal shows how easily reality can be manufactured when one group controls the environment, information, and expectations. The ghosts were fake. Marin's terror was real. Chapter 16. Elise Haynes. The conspiracy has a purpose, and its name is Elise Haynes. Elise was an actress connected to Ronan. He exploited her, secretly recorded intimate encounters, circulated material without meaningful consent, and damaged her professionally. After being discarded and humiliated, Elise died by suicide. Violet, Loretta, Brad, Suzie, Heather, and Julianne all have reasons to care about what happened to her. New Avalon has been transformed into an elaborate psychological trap designed to force Ronan to confess. Their plan resembles a movie because that is the language of power Ronan understands. Now others control the set, the script, and his reality. Chapter 17. Revenge as Theater. The fake haunting reframes everything Marin has experienced. The conspirators did not merely frighten Ronan. They used Marin as an unwitting participant. Her memories of Molly were deliberately exploited during the seance, and her genuine trauma became production material in someone else's revenge. This creates the novel's sharpest moral conflict. Ronan is predatory, but the people exposing him still psychologically injure an innocent outsider. Their cause does not erase Marin's lack of consent. Chapter 18. The Missing Pages. Furious and disoriented, Marin returns to her cottage and discovers hidden pages missing from Daisy's diary. They appear to provide the brutal answer to the century-old mystery. Daisy claims responsibility for Ruth's death and for the deaths or disappearances of the others. For a moment, the supernatural explanation collapses completely. Azra seems unnecessary. Perhaps Daisy was simply a killer whose own diary disguised murder as haunting. Yet Marin is still trying to turn fragments into certainty. The novel keeps reminding us that old documents are not automatically objective. Chapter 19. The Final Seance. The conspirators decide on one final seance to break Ronan. Violet plans to use the performance to lead him toward Elise. But the board unexpectedly spells Daisy's name. Violet collapses and then appears to become Daisy herself. Marin cannot tell whether she is witnessing another trick or something genuinely impossible. Under pressure, Ronan finally admits that Elise was not the only woman he recorded and exploited. The confession reveals a pattern rather than a single mistake. That distinction matters. Abuse can hide when each victim is treated as an isolated story. The seance forces the pattern into one room. Chapter 20. Ronan dies. Ronan still resists giving the group everything they want. Violet takes an ice pick and threatens him, and then the confrontation crosses the line from exposure into killing. She drives the weapon into him. Ronan dies. Afterward, Violet appears horrified and confused, claiming Daisy was controlling her. Marin is left with an impossible moral and practical choice. Instead of exposing the death immediately, she helps Violet carry Ronan's body to the cliff and throw it onto the rocks below. This is where Marin stops being only a manipulated victim. Fear and self-preservation pull her into complicity, and survival no longer preserves innocence. Chapter 21. The body beneath the floor back in her cottage. Marin again hears the strange thumping that has haunted her stay. She tears into the floor and discovers human remains hidden beneath it, along with another diary. The skeleton belongs to Ruth Hume Semple. At last, New Avalon produces a real body, and with it a second version of 1926. Ruth's diary contradicts Daisy's account so completely that the century-old legend begins collapsing from the inside. The symbolism is blunt and effective. The truth was never floating in the seance room. It was buried beneath Marin's feet while mythology lived above it. Chapter 22. The Truth About. Daisy and Azra Ruth's diary reveals that the supposed group of 5 women never existed as the public imagined it. Ruth had brought one traumatized young woman to New Avalon after that woman killed her abusive father in self-defense. Her original identity was Azra. Daisy, Jonquil, Katrina, and Phoebe were presented in Ruth's account as distinct identities experienced by the same person. Daisy eventually became dominant, while the other women of the legend existed through Azra's fractured inner experience rather than as separate physical residents. Ruth attempted a seance because she believed she could bring Azra back to the surface. Daisy interpreted that effort as a threat to her own existence and killed Ruth. The 5-woman legend grew from a catastrophic misunderstanding of one traumatized person. Chapter 23. The most controversial. Twist. The revelation is mechanically clever because it forces the audience to reinterpret almost every clue. The dresses, the diary, the missing women, and even the name Azra. But psychologically, it deserves more caution than a simple killer personality twist. Dissociative identity disorder is a real and complex condition associated with severe trauma, and people living with dissociative disorders are not inherently violent. The novel uses fragmentation as part of a murder mystery, which belongs to a long thriller tradition that can sensationalize mental illness. A responsible reading separates the fictional device from reality. Azra's story works best as a warning about trauma being misunderstood, sensationalized, and turned into legend. Chapter 24. Violet's greatest performance. Ruth's diary gives Marin one final realization. If Daisy was an identity within Azra rather than a dead independent woman haunting the island, Violet could not have been possessed by Daisy in the way she claimed. Violet was acting. She admits that Ronan's death was not an accident produced by supernatural possession. She intended to kill him. Then comes the motive beneath the motive. Elise was Violet's daughter, whom Violet had given up for adoption years earlier. The revenge was therefore intensely personal. Violet destroys Ruth's diary by throwing it into the lake, believing she has erased the proof. But Marin still possesses the memory card from Suzie's camera. For the first time, the unknown actress holds power over the legend and keeps it. Chapter 25. 4 years later, who owns the story? 4 years later, Marin has become a star, with Violet helping elevate her career while everyone connected to New Avalon keeps the truth buried. Lindy is paid to remain silent. Marin also traces Azra's later life and learns that she survived the island, eventually built a future, and married the bootlegger connected to New Avalon. The woman transformed by history into a supernatural mystery had simply continued living. Yet Marin's own ending is intentionally uncomfortable. She uses the evidence she kept as leverage over Violet, converting terrible knowledge into professional power. She arrived on the island desperate not to be unknown. She leaves understanding that uncertainty itself can be currency. That is the deeper meaning of Sager's title. The unknown is not merely what frightens us. It is what people can manipulate. Ronan manipulates women and images. Violet manipulates fear and revenge. History manipulates Azra into a ghost story. Marin finally learns to manipulate the silence around all of them. The book begins with 5 empty dresses and asks us to imagine what happened. It ends by revealing that almost every explanation was shaped by someone who needed the world to believe a particular version. The real horror of New Avalon is therefore not a demon hiding in the woods. It is the human hunger to control the narrative, especially when truth, fame, grief, justice, and ambition all want different endings. Marin gets the career she dreamed about, but the price is becoming someone who understands the same lesson as Ronan and Violet. If you control what people see, you can often control what they believe. And that final transformation may be darker than any ghost the island could have produced.